May 1945. The war was over, but for the women inside that rattling train, the nightmare wasn't finished. The steel wheels screeched against the tracks as the train slowed. Inside the wooden cars, dozens of German women sat in silence, clutching their thin coats, eyes hollow with fear. They weren't soldiers in the traditional sense. Many had served as clerks, radio operators, or auxiliaries in the crumbling Reich. Now they were prisoners of war, headed somewhere deep inside America. Rumors had spread like wildfire in the last days of the Reich. Some swore the Americans would line them up and shoot them the moment they arrived. Others whispered that they'd be forced into mines as slave labor. And every woman feared the same thing: humiliation, starvation, and a slow death in a foreign land. Their uniforms, once crisp, were now threadbare, their boots cracked, their hair tied in makeshift knots. They carried no weapons, no dignity, and no idea of what awaited them. At last, the train groaned to a stop. The heavy doors slid open with a metallic clank. One woman, perhaps 24, her sharp cheekbones carved deeper by hunger, was the first to step down. She braced herself for barking dogs, for guards with whips, for jeering crowds, but instead, silence. The air was startlingly fresh, carrying none of the smoke, dust, or stench of bombed-out Germany. A flat American landscape stretched before her. Wooden fences, green fields, and an unsettling calm. American guards stood waiting in neat uniforms. Their rifles were slung casually, more like tools than threats. They didn't shout. They didn't sneer. They simply gestured for the women to form into lines. The silence was more unnerving than any insult could have been. It felt like the quiet before cruelty. The young woman pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders. Somewhere deep in her chest, she prepared herself for the worst. She had no idea that the most shocking blow to her beliefs wouldn't come from a gun or from chains, but from something as ordinary, as unthinkable as bread. The women shuffled forward, their boots crunching on gravel. The barbed wire glinted in the sunlight, neat and geometric. Still, there was no shouting, no snarling dogs, no swinging rifle butts. Then, it hit them. On the breeze came a smell so familiar, so impossible, it froze them in their tracks. Not the acrid reek of coal smoke or the bitter tang of burnt barley coffee. No, this was warm, rich, almost sweet. The scent of something baking, something alive with comfort. Bread, real bread. One of the women gasped, clutching her chest as though the smell itself had struck her. Another whispered hoarsely, "Nein, es kann nicht sein." No, it can't be. They had not smelled bread like this in years. Back in Germany, bread had become little more than survival fuel. Heavy, black loaves baked from coarse rye or ground-up turnips, stretched thin by rationing. Mothers had stood in endless lines for scraps. Children gnawed crusts so hard they chipped teeth. White bread, soft, fluffy, almost sweet, had vanished long before the war reached its final bloody chapters. To smell it here, in captivity, felt obscene. The young woman of 24, the one who had stepped from the train first, shut her eyes. Memories rose unbidden. Her mother pulling a warm loaf from the oven, a kitchen filled with laughter before sirens replaced song. She saw her younger brother, crumbs on his lips, grinning as though the world were safe. That had been before the bombs, before the hunger, before the nights when she prayed he had survived somewhere in the ruins of Leipzig. And now, here, the enemy was baking bread for prisoners. Her stomach twisted in rebellion, as if it couldn't decide between hunger and rage. Around her, some of the women muttered curses under their breath. Others wept silently. Yet not one of them could stop breathing it in, as though their bodies betrayed their pride. The guards gestured again, firm but not cruel, pointing them toward long, low wooden barracks. From somewhere beyond those walls came the unmistakable crackle of ovens, the rustle of trays being set, and the drifting, maddening smell of warm bread. It was as though a ghost from another world had followed them into captivity, and deep inside, though none dared speak it aloud, one thought flickered in every prisoner's mind. If this is what captivity smells like, what else waits for us in this strange new world? The gates creaked open, and the women braced for the worst. They expected mud, filth, and darkness, the kind of misery they had heard in whispers about Russian prison camps. But instead, the sight that met their eyes was something else entirely. Rows of wooden barracks stood neatly aligned, their walls freshly painted, windows let in shafts of morning sunlight, glinting against panes of glass. Outside, buckets of clean water waited for washing, not for punishment. The air was still and clear, carrying none of the choking smoke they had grown used to back home. The women exchanged uneasy glances. This wasn't paradise, no, but it wasn't hell either. Inside the barracks, the shock deepened. Beds, real beds, stretched in tidy rows, each with a straw mattress and a folded blanket. It wasn't luxurious, but compared to the basements and bombed-out ruins many of them had last called home, it looked almost deliberate in its order. One woman muttered under her breath, bitterness in her voice. "It reminds me of boarding school." Her tone was sharp, mocking, but the words carried a dangerous seed of truth, order, structure, even a trace of comfort. Things they hadn't known in years. The young woman of 24 walked slowly to her assigned bunk. She sat down carefully, half expecting the wooden frame to collapse beneath her. But it held firm. For a moment she simply stared at the ceiling above, her mind torn between suspicion and disbelief. In training halls back in Germany, officers had sworn that capture meant a fate worse than death. They had painted pictures of cruelty, degradation, and starvation. Yet here she was, sitting on a bed, sunlight streaming through a window, the faint smell of bread still drifting in from the kitchens. She clenched her fists. It had to be a trick. The Americans were clever. Everyone said so. This neatness, this calm, this strange normalcy. It must be a performance, a softening before the lash. Her thoughts spun, but her stomach growled louder than her doubts. Somewhere beyond the barracks, smoke curled lazily from the mess hall chimneys. The sound of metal trays being stacked carried through the open air. Whatever waited in that dining hall, she knew one thing. It would test her more than any battlefield ever had. The bell clanged sharply in the courtyard. A command followed, firm, clipped, but not cruel. It was time for their first meal in captivity. The women filed out of the barracks in tense silence, boots shuffling on the gravel. Every step felt heavy, like a march to judgment. None spoke, but their eyes darted nervously toward the long building ahead, the mess hall. Back in Germany, whispers had circulated in the barracks. American camps were brutal, they said. Prisoners were mocked, starved, forced to fight over scraps like animals. Some of the women had convinced themselves this would be their fate, a final stripping of dignity served on a metal tray. As they drew closer, the young woman of 24 gripped her coat tighter. She braced herself for jeers, for slop ladled into buckets, for guards laughing as they watched. Her stomach twisted with hunger, but pride told her to resist whatever insult came next. Then the doors swung open. Instead of filth and chaos, the women froze before a scene that felt almost theatrical in its strangeness. Inside, long rows of tables stood neatly arranged. White plates, not tin cups, waited at every setting. Sunlight poured through windows, glinting off the polished surface of the counters. The room smelled not of decay, but of warmth, smoke, yeast, and the unmistakable presence of bread. And there, behind the serving line, stood American soldiers, wearing aprons. The sight alone was disarming. These men, who only weeks ago might have been firing rifles across battlefields, now stood calmly with ladles and trays. Some wore oven mitts, one flipped something sizzling in a pan. Another adjusted his cap as if he were just another cook in a small-town diner. The women hesitated at the doorway, hearts pounding. It couldn't be real. Surely this was still part of the act, a trick to weaken them before cruelty began. "Move along," a guard said softly in accented German, gesturing toward the line. His tone wasn't mocking. It wasn't kind either, just ordinary. Step by step they entered. The sound met them first. The clatter of trays, the hiss of steam, the crackle of fat in iron pans. The air shimmered with it. Salt, heat, something rich and almost musical in its ordinariness. The young woman's throat tightened. Her hands trembled. This was not what she had been told to expect, and deep down she knew. Whatever they were about to be served would change something far greater than just their empty stomachs. The line shuffled forward. The clink of metal trays echoed in the hall. The women glanced at each other nervously, their eyes filled with suspicion and hunger in equal measure. Then it happened. One prisoner reached the front of the line. An American soldier in an apron set a plate before her. On it lay potatoes, a small piece of meat, and something that made her freeze. A slice of bread. But not the dark, heavy bread they knew in Germany. Not the bitter loaves padded with sawdust flour and turnip meal. This was pale, soft, impossibly white. The woman stared at it as though it were a relic from another world. She reached out hesitantly. The bread yielded beneath her fingers, springing back when she pressed it lightly. It was airy, almost delicate, as if it had come from the memory of a childhood long lost. Gasps rippled through the line behind her. One whispered sharply, "Weissbrot," white bread. The word itself felt dangerous to speak aloud. In Germany, white bread had all but vanished years earlier. Only the wealthy, the party elite, or those with powerful connections had ever tasted it after the war began. For ordinary civilians, and certainly for soldiers, white bread belonged to another lifetime, to mornings before air raids, to kitchens where fathers came home from work, to laughter around family tables. Now, here in enemy captivity, it was being handed out casually, as if it were nothing at all. The young woman of 24, her tray trembling in her hands, looked down at her own slice. Her mind reeled. She thought of her mother, who had died clutching a loaf of black bread during an air raid 2 winters ago. She thought of the children in Dresden, their thin hands reaching for crusts. And now, here, in the hands of her captors, she held what her people had been denied for years. It felt impossible. It felt humiliating. It felt dangerous. Her pride screamed to reject it, to spit it back, to prove that she was not so easily softened by the enemy. But her stomach, her starving, aching body, had other plans. She raised the slice slowly to her lips. And for the first time in years, she tasted white bread, soft, sweet, alive with warmth. Tears welled unbidden in her eyes. She chewed, her throat tightening as the memories of home and hunger collided. Around her, other women stared down at their own slices, their faces torn between rage, disbelief, and yearning. The hall was silent. The only sound was the quiet, fragile act of chewing. And in that silence, something shifted, something far deeper than hunger could ever explain. For a long moment, no one moved. Dozens of German women sat at the long wooden tables, staring down at their plates. The potatoes steamed, the meat gave off a faint aroma of fat. But it was the bread, the white bread, that held them frozen. It was more than food. It was a challenge. The young woman of 24 gripped hers tightly, knuckles white. Her pride hissed in her ear. Don't eat it. Don't let them win. Don't let them see you beg like an animal. But her stomach groaned in defiance. It had been years since she had eaten more than watery soup and coarse black loaves that crumbled like stone in the mouth. She remembered her last meal in Leipzig, a thin broth with turnips and stale bread she split with her younger brother. She hadn't seen him since the air raids. Was he even alive? Would he ever taste bread like this again? Her throat burned. She blinked rapidly, as if the tears rising in her eyes were an enemy she could force back. Around her, the struggle played out on every face. One woman shoved the bread away with a scowl, her jaw tight with defiance. Another clutched hers in both hands, trembling, before lifting it slowly to her lips. A third broke hers in half, staring at the pale interior as though she had discovered a secret, before eating it in silence, tears sliding down her cheeks. The young woman's hands shook as she finally took a bite. The taste, it was overwhelming. Softness where there had been hardness, sweetness where there had been bitterness, warmth where there had only been cold. She wanted to spit it out to prove she was unbroken. But her body betrayed her. She ate quickly, desperately, before reason could return. Each swallow filled her with shame and relief so sharp it felt like grief. Her shoulders sagged. The bread was gone. Her hunger eased, but her mind spun with confusion. Hadn't the Reich promised that Americans were savages? That they would starve their captives, humiliate them, break them like animals? And yet, here she was, fed better in enemy hands than in her own homeland. She lowered her head, ashamed not only of her hunger, but of her doubt. The war inside her belly had been won by a slice of bread. And worse, it had started another war. Not a war of nations, not a war of guns and bombs, but a war inside her very soul. The hall filled with the quietest sound in the world, chewing. No clatter of knives, no chatter of conversation, only the hesitant, uneven rhythm of women deciding, each in her own way, whether to surrender to hunger or cling to pride. At one table, a woman shoved her plate away, her lips pressed in a thin, defiant line. She muttered bitterly in German, "They think they can buy us with bread." Her words carried an edge, but her eyes betrayed her. They kept darting back toward the plate, betraying the gnawing emptiness inside her. At another table, a prisoner bowed her head over the slice, holding it with both hands like a holy relic. She ate slowly, reverently, as though afraid each bite might vanish before she swallowed. Tears slid down her face, but she didn't stop. Others gave in with less hesitation. Some tore into the bread with frantic hunger, stuffing it down before reason or shame could catch up. Their hands shook, crumbs scattering across the table. One woman laughed through her tears, a sharp, almost hysterical sound that startled those around her. The young woman of 24 sat in silence, her tray empty. She stared at her hands, ashamed of how quickly she had devoured her slice. Around her, the contradictions multiplied, pride clashing with need, anger colliding with gratitude, humiliation mixing with relief. The strangest thing was the absence of cruelty. The guards stood by the doors, watching, but not mocking. No jeers, no smirks, just quiet, steady eyes. To the Americans, this was nothing more than breakfast. To the prisoners, it was a battlefield fought on wooden benches and tin trays. One soldier leaned casually against the doorway, his arms folded, an apron still tied over his uniform. His gaze swept across the room without judgment. When one of the women looked up and met his eyes, he gave the smallest shrug, as if to say, "It's just bread." That shrug carried more weight than any weapon. It suggested a world where enemies weren't monsters, where captors could offer kindness, where food wasn't a weapon but a routine. The silence lingered, broken only by the sound of chewing, by muffled sobs, and by the faint, almost musical crackle of bread crust being torn apart. For the first time since stepping onto American soil, the women realized something terrifying. It wasn't cruelty that would undo them. It was mercy. To the women seated at the long wooden tables, this meal was earth-shattering. To the Americans standing watch, it was Tuesday. Private First Class Daniel Harris leaned against the doorframe, arms folded across his apron. He was 30 years old, a farm boy from Iowa who had grown up pulling loaves of white bread from his mother's oven every morning. To him, bread wasn't a luxury. It was life's most ordinary companion, something so common he barely noticed it. He watched the German women nibble, weep, hesitate, and devour. To Harris, their reactions seemed almost strange. "It's just bread," he thought, shaking his head slightly. "What's the big deal?" But Harris couldn't know, that to the prisoners, that slice of white bread meant more than calories. It meant a glimpse into a world their government had sworn didn't exist. Another guard, Sergeant Thomas McLean, stood by the serving line, watching the women with the cool detachment of a man doing his duty. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't kind. He was practical. Feed the prisoners, keep order, move on. To him, these women weren't symbols of a fallen Reich or enemies deserving vengeance. They were just part of the job. One of the cooks, a corporal with flour dusted on his sleeves, flipped another tray of loaves onto the counter. He had baked bread 100 times before, both at home and here in the camp. He barely looked up at the line of Germans. To him, baking for prisoners was no different than baking for soldiers. You followed the recipe, you fed people, you moved on. And yet, for the prisoners, every casual motion was loaded with meaning. The shrug of a guard, the indifference of a cook, the simple presence of a white plate instead of a tin pail. These things cut deeper than shouts or blows ever could. The Germans had been told their captors were brutes, incapable of decency. Yet here the Americans were, serving bread with the same unthinking routine they might show their own men. To the guards, it was nothing. To the women, it was a revelation. One world's ordinary was another world's miracle. And in that gap, in that dizzying contrast, entire belief systems began to crack. That night, the barracks were silent, but no one slept. The women lay on their bunks, staring at the wooden rafters above, their minds racing. The bread still lingered in their mouths, soft and haunting, a ghost of something both comforting and unbearable. For years they had been told the Americans were monsters, that captivity would mean cruelty, starvation, degradation. But instead, they had been handed the one thing Germany hadn't been able to provide for its own people: abundance. The young woman of 24 turned restlessly on her thin mattress. Her stomach was full for the first time in months, but her mind was in turmoil. She thought of her mother's voice, warning her to never trust propaganda, to look with her own eyes. She remembered the air raids, the rubble, the funerals whispered about in the dark. And now she remembered the bread, white, soft, and offered without malice. In the corner of the barracks, another prisoner wept softly into her blanket. She had written a few words in a small, hidden notebook. "The bread is more dangerous than the guns. It makes us doubt." Across the room, a defiant woman whispered curses under her breath, vowing never to be broken. Yet even she could not stop replaying the sight of American cooks ladling food as though feeding prisoners was no different than feeding their own soldiers. The bread had done something no bomb, no battle, no rifle could achieve. It had pierced the armor of certainty. If America could feed its captives with such casual generosity, then what did that say about Germany's war? If the enemy could give them what their own nation could not, what did that mean about everything they had believed? The questions gnawed at them long after the hunger was gone. The barracks creaked softly in the night. Outside, the wind carried the faint scent of wood smoke and distant fields. For the first time in years, there was no sound of bombs, no sirens, just the heavy quiet of a foreign land and the weight of thoughts too dangerous to speak aloud. The women closed their eyes, but sleep never came. The war was over outside the wire. Inside their hearts, it was only beginning. The days began to take on a rhythm. Roll call at dawn, work details in the camp garden or laundry, and 3 meals that arrived like clockwork. But it was the bread that defined everything. Every morning, every noon, every evening, The white loaves appeared. Not scraps, not crusts, but thick slices stacked neatly on trays, sometimes with butter, sometimes with jam, sometimes toasted golden at the edges. At first, the women stared at it with the same suspicion they had felt on that first day. Surely this generosity was temporary, a trick to soften them before punishment. But the bread kept coming, day after day, meal after meal, as steady and unremarkable to the Americans as the rising sun. For the prisoners, it was unbearable in its simplicity. One woman tried to resist. She swore to herself that she would not touch another slice, that she would cling to her pride and prove she could not be bought. But by the second day, hunger gnawed away at her defiance. By the third, she was eating in silence, her tears falling into the crumbs on her plate. Another woman, older, her hair streaked with grey, began saving tiny pieces of bread in her pocket, wrapping them in cloth. At night, she would take them out and hold them, as if the bread itself was a treasure. She whispered that she wanted to send it home to her children, though she knew she never could. The young woman of 24 ate each slice with a quiet reverence, torn between gratitude and shame. She remembered how her little brother used to beg for bread, how her mother once traded her wedding ring for a single black loaf in the winter of 44. And here, in captivity, she was given more than her family had seen in years. It was a kindness that cut like a knife. The Americans didn't lecture them. They didn't boast or gloat. They didn't say, "See, this is what victory looks like." They simply served bread as though it were nothing, as though it were no different than air or water. That casual abundance was worse than any speech. By the end of the week, the disbelief in the barracks had deepened into something else, a gnawing sense of inferiority. If the enemy could feed prisoners like this while their own people at home starved, what hope had Germany ever truly had? Each slice of bread was a reminder of defeat, a reminder of lies, a reminder that the Reich had promised strength. But America had delivered bread, and bread, it seemed, was stronger than bullets. By the second week, the silence in the barracks had changed. It was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence of doubt. The women had eaten slice after slice of bread, each one more disorienting than the last. Every meal chipped away at the fortress of certainty the Reich had built inside their minds. And now, cracks were spreading through that fortress faster than they could be patched. One evening, as the women lay on their bunks, a quiet voice broke the stillness. "They told us the Americans were barbarians." It came from the gray-haired woman who saved crumbs in her pocket. Her voice trembled, not from fear, but from something heavier, shame. "But barbarians do not give bread like this, not every day, not without demand." No one answered at first. The truth was dangerous, even here, even now. Yet the silence itself was an answer. Another woman finally whispered, bitter and broken, "If our people at home starve while the enemy feeds us, what does that say about everything we believed?" The young woman of 24 turned away, clutching her blanket. She wanted to deny it. She wanted to believe the Reich had been strong, that the fatherland had been betrayed only by circumstance, not by failure. But the bread in her stomach made denial impossible. It was not just the food, it was the casualness of it. The Americans did not serve bread to prove a point. They did not mock them as they ate. They gave it freely, thoughtlessly, as if generosity were the most natural thing in the world. And that, more than bombs, more than tanks, more than battlefields, was what broke the spell. For years, propaganda had painted the Americans as weak, decadent, corrupt. But weakness did not look like this. Decadence did not look like loaves stacked higher than a prisoner's head. A Reich that had promised glory had delivered rubble and hunger. The enemy, painted as monsters, had delivered bread and meat and coffee with cream. The comparisons were unavoidable. One prisoner summed it up in a single sentence, spoken so softly that only those nearest her could hear. "If they can give white bread to their enemies, then how could we ever hope to defeat them?" The words hung in the air like a confession. No one challenged her. No one dared. The propaganda had collapsed, not under speeches or arguments, but under the quiet, undeniable truth of daily life. And all it took was bread. Weeks passed, and the white bread never stopped coming. By then, the women no longer gasped when the loaves appeared, no longer whispered in disbelief. But the wonder never truly faded. For the young woman of 24, each slice remained both a comfort and a wound. She ate it quietly, remembering her mother's kitchen, her brother's laughter, the family table that war had shattered. She remembered how the Reich had promised strength, yet left her people hungry. And here, across the ocean, in the hands of her captors, she had found what her homeland could no longer provide. One evening, she sat outside the barracks, watching the sunset bleed across the American sky. In her lap rested a piece of bread she had saved from dinner, wrapped in a napkin. She broke it slowly, carefully, as if it were more fragile than glass. "It's just bread," she whispered to herself, but even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. It was proof that the enemy was not the monster she had been taught to fear, proof that abundance could be stronger than violence, proof that sometimes the smallest kindness could unravel years of lies. The war had ended with bombs, tanks, and surrender papers. But for her, and for many others like her, the real defeat came in a dining hall, at a wooden table, with a slice of white bread in her hands. Because bread had done what weapons could not. It had broken not her body, but her certainty. And in that moment, she understood something profound. Empires fall, armies crumble, propaganda fades, but the quiet power of mercy endures. She raised the last piece to her lips, chewed slowly, and let the truth settle deeper than hunger. The war was over, but its meaning, the lesson written not in gunfire but in bread, would remain with her for the rest of her life. And now I want to hear from you. What do you think that moment must have felt like? Tasting white bread in captivity after years of hunger and war. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I love reading your perspectives and sharing them with our community. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to give it a like. It really helps more folks discover these untold pieces of history. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. We've got many more powerful, hidden World War II stories coming your way. Stories that will surprise you, move you, and make you see the war in a whole new light. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.